poetry lovers, welcome to my channel Bella Poetry. In this segment we will discuss the life and the works of another famous British novelist and poet, George Elliott. Her real name was Mary Ann Evans. Mary Ann Evans was born on November 22nd, 1819 in rural Warwickshire. Her father, Robert Evans, was married before he had 2 children. His wife passed away in 1809 and he married Mary Ann's mom, Kishinev, and they had 3 children, Chrissy, Isaac, and Mary Ann. Robert Evans was the estate manager for the Arbory Hall estate owned by Newtigate, very rich Newtigate family. And so all the children, when they grew older, had an access to a wonderful Arbory Hall library that allowed them to have a good education. It was important for Robert to give his children good education because he wanted his daughters to have skills to provide for themselves in the future. The first school that Mary Evans attended was when she was 5 years old. It was called Mrs. Latham School, and she attended it with her sister Chrissy. Mary Ann was very plain looking, but she was extremely clever and a very good student. After this school, she continued at Mrs. Wilmington's school for about 4 years and came under the influence of Maria Lewis, who was the principal governess, and she instilled in Mary Ann evangelical piety. After the second school, she continued into her third school, owned by Mrs. Franklin, and there her religious ardor increased even more. But in 1836, when Mary Ann turned 16 years old, her mother, Christiana, passed away. And Mary Ann and her father basically remained alone. She wasn't very close to her mom. She was closer to her father and to her brother Isaac, but the mother suffered tremendously before she passed away, and Mary Ann stayed by her side and took care of her, and in the last month of her life, the 2 women became very close as well. So in 1841, Isaac, her brother, married a nice girl, and they took over the family home, which forced Mary Ann and her father to look for another place to live, and they moved to Coventry. When they moved to Coventry, something happened to Mary Ann. She was very modest, religious, pious, but in Coventry, she met a lot of liberal radicals. She started hanging out with them, and the couple that she spent a lot of time with were called Charles and Caroline Bray, who were very wealthy, but who also held socialist anti-religious views, and she became very, very friendly with them, to the point where she told her dad that she felt hypocritical attending the church with him. The father was extremely upset. It caused a great conflict between the two. Mary Ann went to live with her brother Isaac in her old home, but after 5 months, she went back to her dad and compromised, told him that she will attend the church every Sunday with him until he dies. And she did exactly that. So when Mary Ann turned 30, her father unfortunately passed away. And that was a big, big shock to Mary Ann. Although they differed in their views, Mary Ann loved her dad very much and they were very close. She wrote after his passing that she lost the moral compass and she didn't know how to be without his direction. But 5 days after his death, she joined Caroline and Charles Bray on the trip. They went together to Switzerland. They spent some time there. She read a lot and she wrote, and in 1850 she moved to London. In London she met John Chapman. John Chapman was a very smart man. He was a journalist and a writer, a philanderer. He was very, very handsome, and he offered Marianne to stay at his house in exchange for her editing his manuscripts. And Marianne agreed. Why did John Chapman choose Marianne? Because through Caroline Bray, she met the father of Caroline's brother's wife, Dr. Brabant, and Dr. Brabant introduced her to his daughter, who asked Marianne to translate a very controversial book at that time called The Life of Jesus Christ, which was written by David Strauss. She had to translate it from German to English. Dr. Brabant was an older man. He was in his 60s, but Marianne kind of spent a lot of time with him and became strongly infatuated with him, and that to a great dissatisfaction of his wife, who was actually blind, but who had a sister who reported to her that she saw them spend a lot of time together, looking more romantic than friendly. So the wife demanded that Marianne didn't visit their home at all. So that's what happened. But she found a place to live with John Chapman. But the same thing happened there. John Chapman was very handsome, women loved him, and she became infatuated with him. They spent a lot of time together talking about literature and so forth. She played piano for him. She was a very good piano player. And at one time, the wife decided to move the piano to the living room to prevent them from spending so much time together. Then she started giving him German lessons, so there was a lot of drama going on in the house. In addition to the drama between Chapman and Marianne, there was also a mistress, Chapman's mistress, the governess of his children, who lived in the same house. There was a wife, the mistress, and Mary Ann. At the end, the wife and the mistress united and demanded from John Chapman to throw Marianne out of their house because they were jealous and were not happy with his living arrangement. So Marianne then met another man whose name was Howard Spencer. He was the editor of Economist, and she fell in love with him too, but he was not interested in her. He only liked her as a companion, somebody to talk to. And he told her that straight away, that I do not want any romantic relationship with you. But in 1851, John Chapman opened a magazine called Westminster Review, and he asked Marianne to be the secret editor for the review, and he begged his wife to take Marianne back as a boarder so she can work from his home, and the wife agreed. So Marianne went back to John Chapman, and being the editor of Westminster Review, she was in the middle of the literary circle, and a lot of writers and poets would come around, and she met a man who will become her husband. Now, his story is also very complicated. His name was George Lewis. George Lewis was also married. He married his wife, Agnes Jervis, when in 1841. But the relationship was very unstable. He decided to open a periodical, The Leader, with his friend Thornton Hunt, and his wife and Thornton Hunt fell in love and had an affair, and his wife became pregnant. When the son was born, George Lewis adopted the son and gave him his name. But sometime later, Agnes got pregnant again with Thornton Hunt's son, and at that point, George Lewis realized that his marriage was finished. What kind of a man was George Lewis? He was very smart, very witty, the life of the party, and he and George Elliott, Marianne Evans, started to really like each other and spending a lot of time together. And so in 1854, they went together to Germany and had an amazing year there. But what happened is that they became shunned by Marianne's family. Her brother would not, since the parents were dead, the brother was the only one besides her sister Chrissy that were left, and he refused to accept their relationship because they were not married, and George Louis was married to another woman. He wanted to divorce, but he couldn't because he condoned her relationship, and so he was prohibited from getting the divorce. George Louis, by the way, was extremely unattractive, although very, very witty, just like Marianne Evans. He was called the ugliest man in London. But the looks didn't prevent them from falling in love. And so they lived together for 25 years. When they returned, they settled in London. Marianne Evans, with the support and love from George Louis, became very, very prolific. She wrote 7 novels, 2 books of poetry, did a lot of translations. 3 books, actually 3 novels stand out that I want to mention here is in 1859, when she was 39 years old, she wrote her first book called Adam Bede. And this book was very popular, became a tremendous success right away. Even Queen Victoria and Prince Albert loved the book and read it twice, and Queen Victoria ordered 2 watercolors based on the scenery described in this book. And so the other book that I want to mention is when she turned 52 in 1872, she wrote the book Middlemarch, A Study of a Provincial Life. And it was called the greatest novel in the English language. And another book that was also very important was called Daniel de Ronda, and she wrote it in 1876 at the age of 57. And so this book dealt with anti-Semitism that was very prevalent in England at that time. And she, Marianne Evans, called out the British society for being anti-Semitic and not tolerant of other people's religions and culture. So this was an important book that she wrote. Now, when she turned 59 years old in 1878 in November, George Louis passed away. And for Marianne Evans, this was a terrible loss because George Louis supported her, inspired her. He was her backbone, and he took care of all the practical things. So when he passed away, everything fell on her shoulders. In the beginning, she didn't even want to leave the house, and she completed his book, which was called Problems of Life and Mind. And she also established George Louis studentship in physiology at Cambridge. So she continued to be very active and very prolific and wanted to ensure her husband's legacy. But that wasn't the end of her romantic history, because when she turned 60 years old, 61, she met the guy whose name was John Cross. He was actually the accountant for the family. He was very young. He was 41 years her junior. And John Cross also suffered a loss 1 week before Marianne lost her husband. He lost his mother. So 2 of them kind of found this commonality and started to spend a lot of time together and keeping each other's company, and seemingly fell in love. And they decided to get married. So in 1880, John Cross and Marianne Evans married, and they went to Venice on their honeymoon. Something happened in Venice. In the hotel, maybe John Cross realized that he made a huge mistake because suddenly he saw that this much older woman is next to him. We don't know really what was the reason. Maybe he mourned his mother's death still, but he jumped out of the window into the canal trying to commit suicide and was fished out of the canal. He survived, and the couple went back to England. But just 4 months later, Marianne started having problems with her throat. She had a bacterial infection. She also had issues with her kidneys, and she passed away. It was December 22nd, 1880, at the age of 61, that Marianne Evans, pen name George Elliott, died. She was buried in Highgate Cemetery in London, next to her beloved George Lewis. This was a cemetery for agnostics and liberal radicals, and she obviously fit in. Before we part, I wanted to read to you, first of all, one quote by George Elliott that I personally love, and it says, "It's never too late to be what you might have been." Very deep and philosophical quote. The first poem that I'll read to you by George Elliott is called Roses. You love the roses, so do I. I wish the sky would rain down roses as they rain from off the shaken bush. Why will it not? Then all the valley would be pink and white and soft to tread on. They would fall as light as feathers, smelling sweet, and it would be like sleeping and like waking all at once. I love the sentence, I wish the sky would rain down roses. Beautiful. The second one is called Mid My Gold Brown Hairs. Mid my gold brown curls, they're twined as silver hair, I plucked it idly out, and scarcely knew 'twas there. Coiled in my velvet sleeve it lay, and like a serpent hissed. Me thou canst pluck and fling away, one hair is lightly missed. But how on that near day, when all the wintry army muster in array? So one hair is not a problem, but what happens when you are covered in gray hair? So just two very nice poems. And that brings our segment to its end. Next time, in our next segment, we're going to be talking about another British novelist and poet, Amy Levy. Please don't forget to subscribe. Press the subscribe buttons and you'll be receiving more segments of Bella Poetry. Thank you so much for visiting us and hope to see you again. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. Bye-bye.